The kimchi on your table right now, blazing red, sharp enough to clear your sinuses, is younger than jazz. For most of its documented 2,000-year existence, kimchi wasn't spicy. It wasn't even red. It was pale, watery, and salted, buried in clay jars underground through the Korean winter. Here's what this video is actually about: how a plain method for keeping vegetables alive through winter became the most identity-defining dish on the Korean peninsula. Most people assume kimchi has always looked and tasted the way it does in a Korean barbecue restaurant today: fiery, red, cabbage-based. But the version you know is a relatively recent invention, layered onto something far older and stranger. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly when kimchi turned red, why it almost didn't use cabbage at all, and why two countries are currently fighting over who gets to claim it. This is drawn from Korean historical texts like the Samguk Sagi, peer-reviewed food history research, and the ongoing diplomatic record, not folklore. Let's start with why kimchi exists at all. The Korean peninsula has brutal winters and a short growing season. Fresh vegetables simply vanish for months at a time. Therefore, ancient communities on the peninsula needed a way to lock in nutrients before the frost, and salt brining was the answer. The Samguk Sagi, a 12th century history of Korea's Three Kingdoms period from 57 BC to 668 AD, references pickle jars used for fermenting vegetables, evidence that fermented food was already common practice among the Goguryeo people. But there's a second force that's rarely mentioned: religion. During the Silla dynasty, Buddhism spread rapidly across the peninsula and pushed vegetarian eating into the mainstream. That mattered enormously because a vegetarian population eating through a frozen winter needs vegetables to last, and pickling was the only reliable technology available. Therefore, what looks like a simple food preservation trick was actually two forces colliding: geography, that made winter deadly to fresh produce, and a religious shift that removed meat as a fallback. That combination is why fermented vegetables became a 5 times a day habit instead of an occasional pantry item. That explains why kimchi began. But it doesn't explain why the kimchi you're picturing right now, red, spicy, cabbage-based, took another 15 centuries to arrive. Here's the part that surprises most people. For roughly the first 1,500 years of kimchi's existence, there was no chili pepper in it at all. Early kimchi, described in the 12th century text Dongguk Yisanggukjip, was salted radish and turnip, sometimes colored and flavored with mustard seed, turmeric, or the flowering plant windflower. Picture a Goryeo dynasty household in deep winter, prying open an earthenware jar buried in the frozen ground and pulling out vegetables that are pale, briny, faintly sour, closer in spirit to a watery pickle than a jolt of heat, something much closer to today's dongchimi. The clear radish water kimchi still served alongside spicy meals to cool the mouth down. That was the standard for over a millennium. Therefore, the fiery red kimchi eaten today isn't the traditional version at all. It's a comparatively modern layer on top of a much older, blander dish. That alone rewires how you should think about authentic kimchi. But the reason chili pepper eventually showed up is tangled in one of Korean food history's messiest disputes. The most repeated story is that chili peppers, native to Central America, reached Korea via Japan in the late 16th century. They were carried along Portuguese trade routes into Japan and then crossed the peninsula around the time of the Imjin War, Japan's invasion of Korea starting in 1592. One dramatic version even claims Japanese forces tried to weaponize chili powder against Korean troops. That detail is almost certainly exaggerated folklore. But the broader Portuguese to Japan to Korea route has real documentary support. The first clear Korean reference to chili appears in the 1614 encyclopedia Jibong Useol, Disputed. A minority of Korean researchers push back hard on this entire timeline, arguing that genetic and agricultural evidence makes a sudden 16th century arrival implausible, and that some form of native Korean chili predates the war. That theory hasn't displaced the mainstream account, but it's a real, unresolved argument in Korean food scholarship, and it says something about how emotionally loaded a spice can become once it's tied to national identity. What's well documented either way is that even after chili arrived, it took roughly 2 more centuries before it became standard in kimchi, mainly because it let Koreans cut down on expensive salt while still preserving the vegetables through fermentation. So the color came late, but the vegetable itself came even later. If you assumed kimchi has always meant napa cabbage, that's the second myth this video needs to break. For most of kimchi's history, the primary vegetable wasn't cabbage, it was radish. Dishes like kakdugi and dongchimi aren't kimchi spin-offs, they're closer to the original template. Napa cabbage, the leafy vegetable that defines kimchi today, wasn't widely cultivated on the Korean peninsula until the late 19th century, arriving from China during the late Joseon dynasty. The cookbook Siwjeonseo, compiled around that period, contains what food historians consider the earliest recipe resembling today's whole-leaf cabbage kimchi. Therefore, the classic red napa cabbage kimchi, the one stacked in cinematic layers of chili paste between leaves, is a product of the final decades of the Joseon dynasty, meaning it's roughly 150 years old. Compare that to kimchi's 2,000-year timeline, and the modern version is a single recent chapter, not the whole book. That's the moment kimchi finally became the dish you'd recognize. But turning a household pickling method into a national symbol required one more ingredient, an entire community ritual built around it. Every autumn, Korean families still gather for Kimjang, the mass production of a household's entire winter kimchi supply in one coordinated effort, historically timed to the first frost so the vegetables would keep. Picture dozens of relatives and neighbors crouched over enormous basins, salting mountains of napa cabbage, mixing gochugaru with garlic, ginger, and fermented seafood called jeotgal by hand, then packing everything into jars once buried in the earth to hold a steady, cellar-like temperature through the winter. That underground burial was not decorative. It was refrigeration technology centuries before refrigerators existed, using the earth itself as a temperature-stable vault. UNESCO recognized Kimjang in 2013 as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity, specifically citing how it strengthens Korean identity and cooperation across class and regional lines. Therefore, kimchi was never just food, it was, and still is, a scheduled act of collective labor that binds a household and a neighborhood together once a year. That tradition nearly collided with modern apartment living. But instead of dying out, it triggered an entire consumer industry. By the 1990s, most Koreans had moved into high-rise apartments with no yard to bury a jar in. So in 1995, the company Winyamando launched Dimchae, the first dedicated kimchi refrigerator, an appliance engineered to imitate the exact humidity and rock-steady cold of an underground clay jar. Samsung and LG followed with their own competing lines. And by the early 2010s, surveys suggested a majority of Korean households owned one specialized appliance whose entire purpose was replicating what a hole in the ground used to do for free. Therefore, 21st century engineers spent decades and real R&D budgets trying to outperform dirt. And once kimchi had industrialized at home, it stopped staying home, which set up the strangest twist in its whole story. In November 2020, an international standards body issued new manufacturing guidelines for Pao Cai, a pickled Sichuan vegetable dish, and Chinese state media framed the news as if China had just set the global standard for kimchi itself. South Korean officials, media, and citizens reacted furiously, pointing out that the ISO document explicitly stated the ruling did not apply to kimchi at all. The dispute escalated. South Korea's government eventually proposed Shinki as an official new Chinese language name for kimchi, specifically to stop it from being labeled with the same word used for Pao Cai, though the new term proved so unpopular in China that the old name quietly returned. The conflict spilled past food entirely, touching celebrity apologies, canceled TV dramas, and eventually a full-page advertisement in the New York Times asserting kimchi's Korean origin. Therefore, a fermented side dish that started as a way to survive winter had become, 4 centuries later, a flashpoint serious enough to require diplomatic-grade advertising. So here is where all of that lands. The kimchi you are about to eat tonight is not one dish. It is a timeline compressed into a single jar. The salt and radish version is Silla Dynasty survival technology. The red color is a 16th to 18th century import, still argued over by scientists. The napa cabbage is barely a century and a half old, and the identity wrapped around all of it, the ownership, the ritual, the international arguments, is something Korea has actively fought to keep telling as its own story. What actually survived 2,000 years was not a recipe. It was a method: salt, time, and a jar, repeated by every generation that needed to make a harvest outlast a winter. Next time someone tells you kimchi is just a spicy side dish, you can tell them it is actually a 2,000-year-old survival system that only put on red 200 years ago, and Korea is still defending the jar.